Thank you, Ben. That was very kind. I'm not sure how I can follow that, but I don't know the rest of you, but thank you very much for coming. The weather's been appalling. I think we've brought a bit of the English sunshine, or lack of it, with me. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I didn't actually pack any winter clothes. So let's crack on to the actual panel session. So I started off with, has Pharma fixed its broken innovation model? So I thought, what is the best way to look at how to measure innovation? So I thought perhaps one way would be to look at the number of FDA-approved NMEs over a relatively long period of time. So I looked at this. When I looked at this, I thought, maybe I should actually stay at home because it looks as if there's been a dramatic improvement over the last 3 to 4 years. And then I thought to myself, well, is there a better way of measuring that? And I thought, approvals are one thing. What about sales? So I thought, why don't I look at the US sales of these products that have, after 5 years post-launch? And it was at this point I thought, maybe I should change the title of the session. But if you look at the numbers slightly more closely, go back, then you can see, looking at 2016, if you're contrarian, you could argue that that means that the other numbers are actually outliers. Because if you look at the 14 years preceding 2016, where there were only 26 approvals, the average is around 33 approvals per year. And so the rest of it kind of roughly pegs that. And also, at this point, we're almost halfway through 2018, there have only been 14 new approvals in the US. So, there's a strong argument that, years 2014, 15, and 17 could be outliers. And also, if you look at the sales again, the big increase in sales are for recently launched products such as Ocrevus or Dupixent. And a lot of these are actually forecast sales rather than actual sales. And, sometimes sell-side analysts can get a bit excited, as we've seen with things like the PCSK9s or Entresto. So sometimes drugs don't actually live up to the expectations around them. So when I was looking at this, it seems like it could be slightly more nuanced than saying we've got a return to innovation. So another measure I thought to myself is approvals are one thing, forecast sales another one. How much does it actually cost to get these products to market? It was at this point I felt a lot happier about getting on the plane. So I think this slide, this shows the total R&D spend, accumulated R&D spend required to get one new drug onto the market, with the assumption that an R&D period is 10 years. The analysis is using Evaluate Pharma data, and it looks at all global launches over the last 18 years. And excludes generics, obviously, and also drugs where we didn't find any sales.
Excuse me, is it $25 billion per drug?
I said, wait a minute. I like to think this slide neatly demonstrates the cost of failure. So this is all the R&D dollars spent on all shots on goal. So this is total what you spend to get one drug to the market. So I said that is the cost of failure. So in 2000, it cost 10 years, and this is also accumulated 10-year R&D spend as well. So it's not just one particular year. So in 2000, it cost $2.6 billion of preceding R&D to get one new drug, and this is one novel molecular entity onto the market. This, as you can see, rose to 26 or 23 billion in 2017, after peaking at 26 billion in 2016. If you remember, 2016 was the year when only 26 novel drugs were approved in the US, the pharma's biggest market. So you can see, if innovation is in the industry, which we are seeing perhaps people would argue with the CAR-Ts and also some of the gene therapy products, it's coming at a particularly prohibitive cost. And indeed, commentators like Kelvin Stott have argued that by 2020, pharma's return on investment could have dropped to 0. So it looks like there could be an innovation crisis within the industry. And then also, it needs to look at where is this innovation actually, where it does exist, coming from. So here we can see these going back to, these are 8 years worth of NME approvals in the US. As we can see, over 50% of the R&D required to get these drugs to market is external. And then sort of internal efforts are well below 50%. And if you break that down even further, we can see that the majority of that, in turn, is M&A, with the exception perhaps of 2017. And this could be because we've seen asset prices increase, and maybe 2017 is the start of the pushback, where people have favoured in-licensing and product acquisitions over M&A. But if you want to look at this on a more sort of global scale, rather than using the US, I've also done this analysis as well. So here you can see there was a big jump in sort of like this combined R&D, M&A, and in-licensing spend by pharma globally over a period of 18 years. And as you can see, in 2000, there was a huge spike up to 600 billion. That mainly was attributable to Glaxo Wellcome buying SmithKline Beecham in that year. And then the other kind of sort of large sort of spikes we've seen, so again, break them down from M&A. M&A is the red and grey is R&D. The other big spikes we've seen in M&A have been through 2008 through 2009, which is when we saw some of the mega mergers happen ahead of the patent cliff, when we saw Pfizer buy Wyeth, Schering-Plough taken out, and also Genentech taken out by Roche. And then again, in 2014 and 15, that was the consolidation that we saw from the specialty pharma groups getting together, the Valiants and Allergans, and we all know how that worked out. So it seems like, if we look at the figures again, if you look at 2000, when we had one of the biggest bets on innovation with the 600 billion spent, if you look 10 years down the line, globally, there are only 93 drugs launched. And that compares, let's say, with 2004, when 250,000 spent in 1 year, not taking into account the cumulative spend. So the 10-year cumulative spend would have been a lot less. And then in 2014, we had 110 drugs approved, which demonstrates that you can't actually, it seems, you can't buy innovation. And on that note, I'm going to take the conversation over to my panelists. Would they like to come up? And I'll introduce them. I think Bernard's sitting in my seat. So my panelists, starting with Bernard Munos, who's a senior fellow at Fast Cures and the founder of InnoThink. Next to him is Jessica Federer, who is the founder of Innovayte. And then we also have Steve Wooding, head of Global Commercial Strategy Organisation at Janssen. So, Bernard, I'm going to start with you because you've written a lot on this subject. I don't know if anybody follows Bernard's work. I mean, looking at some of the sort of data that we've seen on the screen there, I mean, are we seeing a fall off in innovation? Is that in your opinion?
Well, the data shows lots of reason to be pessimistic, but I am actually optimistic for various reasons. I think, the data sucks. I mean, let's put it in plain English. But on the other hand, there are a number of signs that are pointing to a reversal of trends, and I'll just mention a few of them. Number one, I think you've got a new generation of CEOs across the industry that are really good, and a marked improvement over what the industry has had in the past without being disparageous. So I think that's good. I mean, those are people who are willing to look at the facts as they are and make the tough decisions. And that's what the industry needs, because in order to reverse those trends, we're going to need to make a lot of tough decisions. So that's number one. Number two, I think you have science, which is delivering a cornucopia of innovation that are reaching the markets. Some of them are earlier, but all point out to an explosion of innovation the like of which I don't think we've seen in decades. And we've got, thousands of entrepreneurs, 20,000 here this week, that are helping translate that into commercial products. And that's good because to change the trend that you just saw, we need innovation, far more than we've seen in the past. Then you've got, problems that are causing what you saw in the past, and it's basically the enormous structural costs that we have in this industry. When you have, when you're 20, 30, 40, $50 billion big, the cost of doing anything tends to be, enormous. And that's what you're seeing here. The industry needs to deal with that. And there's various ways and models that people are talking about or experimenting with, but there's a willingness to do that as opposed to being in denial, which is where the industry has been for several decades. So I think there is an acknowledgement that the situation is tough and we need to change it, and I see more willingness to do that than I've seen in my 30 plus years in the industry.
Steve, as our big pharma representative, are you seeing that? The willingness to change? You are part of one of the bigger pharma groups?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is recognition that there needs to be change. I think the other thing, just to sort of open this up, is I wouldn't equate an NME with innovation. And I think that's part of the issue, is that the definition of innovation has to change, and with it, the industry will change to follow that. So the old model of everybody producing the same thing and believing that they could just put it out there and make money out of it has really gone. And the notion of developing an NME just as a new chemical entity, it's not even enough that it's a new medical entity. It needs to be a new market accessible entity to actually really have an impact in the market, which I think is a lot of the reason behind your slides. I think if you start with the premise that you have to go after an unmet medical need, and you have to be prepared to accept the fact that as you're in development, there will be medical needs that get met. We've seen that, for example, in Hep C. So a lot of companies went into the space, some excellent drugs were produced. How long do you want to stay in that space producing another drug that pretty much does the same thing with falling prices and so on and so forth? And that's, it used to be that the limiting factor was your patent life, and it still is, significantly so. But innovation is happening so quickly now that it's quite possible that you will be, or you could be, coming out of that market before the end of your patent life because something else comes along. So it's really going after things that have an unequivocal promotable advantage and meet an unmet need. And I think that changes the way we then have to look at the business.
I'm going to have to challenge you on that one. Look at the migraine market, the CGRP market. We are now in this phase where we're going to see maybe 4 or 5 products with the same mechanism of action coming to the market within 12 to 18 months. So while you're saying that we are seeing, people aren't doing Me Too medicines, it does seem to be the herd mentality does seem to be still around. I didn't say
that everybody's doing it. Okay, so I think there is still significant change, but I think what is going to drive that change is some, people learning that if you have got something that is differentiated and meeting an unmet need, and by that I don't mean if you just bring a drug that does the same as all the other drugs, because how low do you want your lipids to go? How before nobody cares anymore? How effective is your new treatment? It may be a different way of treating migraine, but if the market is satisfied with what it's got at the price it has, you're going to see that being reserved, and we've seen that with the PCSK9s being sort of step edited right back into 4th or 5th position, and a lot of then significant negotiation going on as to how many drugs you want to choose from. So you can carry on doing it the old way, or you can say that actually is not going to feed the beast in the long term, and we have to change.
Jessica, you've got sort of a more digital background, so we're going to come on to that a bit later, but are you seeing that sort of innovation helping?
Absolutely. I think the topic of our talk here is about the broken pharma model, and it's not really broken. It's just really slow and really expensive. But that has worked in previous ecosystems. It's just that now we're so much more demanding of what we expect with the data we have available and with the tools we have at our disposal. And so, I am excited by the potential that digital has to make really transformative leaps. So an example is the baseline study that Verily is doing. You know, you've got a former head of the FDA partnering with some of the hottest scientists out there to really look at what's the baseline of a human. So like they did with Google Maps, what is mapping every road, taking the same approach when it comes to the human. And the potential there is that we'll be able to have, by having that depth of information, have much faster, more precise trials, right? So we'll be able to just change the way we innovate. You know, there's also innovations that are more on the real world evidence side, like a new company out of New Haven, Hugo Health, where they're pulling together, you know, using technology in a way that we've all wanted to do forever, but it's finally possible, to pull together that real world 360 live cam view, right, of the patient's data, syncing from pharmacies and hospitals and different systems in the US, where they all speak different languages, and giving that holistic, comprehensive perspective so that innovators can actually develop differently and have their phase 4 studies be much more productive because they're not chasing down source data. So I think the potential for digital to aid in the pharmaceutical innovation is there. The question is now the appetite of these big giants to take the risk, right? It's you know, Proteus shopped around their technology for a long time, and many of the big brands just weren't willing to take a risk with $1 billion baby to put a chip in it. You know, that's a lot of added risk to a potential blockbuster product. So, you know, that's where we're at now, is this tension between needing to take a risk and not wanting to.
Bernard, you saying that, you know, we're seeing some new CEOs out there. Are these the kind of, are you going to name names? This would be quite handy if you could.
No, sorry?
Are you going to name names about these new innovative CEOs? Come on.
Oh yeah, I can. Well, the Vash, for example, at Novartis is making waves, and he's brilliant. And he's saying the right thing, and so far has done the right thing, and that's very encouraging. I think across town, Severin Schwan has been at his job now for some time, but he too has, I think, an accurate vision of the industry and the courage to admit, you know, its weaknesses and its strengths, including that of his own company. Those are and J&J is another example where you have a head of research there who doesn't mince his word and says the way it is, and doesn't mind to, I mean, as redesign the early R&D system at J&J in order to harness new technologies on a scale that has never been done before. So, I mean, those developments are very encouraging. That's a type of leaders that you need, who will stick their neck out, who have a vision first and then will follow it. And I think we're seeing more and more of those things happen. But, you know, if there's one thing that perhaps differentiates or starts to differentiate what we see today from what we've seen in the past, and it is historically the industry has put an emphasis on scale. And you heard it countless times. You had to be big, to succeed in this business. It justified, spending hundreds of billions of dollars on merger and acquisition and, mega budget, R&D budget, and so forth. And what has it produced? Well, in reality, not much. All those merger and acquisitions, if you run through the numbers, and I've done it multiple times, they've had basically not much impact on the key success metric or metrics of success in the industry, which are basically how many drugs you get approved there, but not only how many drugs you get approved, whether those drugs have value. One thing that is clear is that scale does succeed to the extent that it brings more new drugs to the market. Those big R&D budgets spent by the companies that spend them do bring more drugs to the market. The problem is that those drugs tend to be mediocre seller. And the result, after years of this thing, is that you end up with unsustainable giants. Companies that are big by virtue of the drugs that they bring to the market, but they just don't sell. Then they've got a problem with sustainability. To fix that problem, they go and buy somebody else, so I mean, it's just a nightmare. It just changed the focus, which is no longer on innovation, but on survival and maintaining revenue. That doesn't work. The companies that I think are making headways are the one that instead of putting their focus, the onus on scale, instead put the focus on innovation. Doing everything, the R&D that they do, has to be innovative. If it doesn't pass muster, it won't be pursued. So you've got companies like Gilead, like Bristol Myers, J&J in that space, but that space is very thinly populated. But this is where the companies that follow that track basically are the one who are commercially successful because they bring drugs that have value to markets. Those drugs get traction and ultimately are successes. And as a result of that, the companies grow. So scale is really a result of success, not a condition to success. And I think we understand that better now. And I think the CEOs that are running the industry are more likely to understand that and to act upon, this kind of different way to look at the industry.
Okay. Steve, once again, I'm falling on you as a big pharma expert. Bernard mentioned you as quite an innovator in the industry. Is there anything that J&J is doing in particular that differentiates, that you can highlight, that separates you from perhaps some of the less innovative companies out there?
I think it would be invidious of me to blow the trumpet too hard. And I'm very pleased you weren't rude about my boss, so that was very good. I think what we've done is basically try and embrace innovation really in a culture. But we've done it on the basis of unmet need, and we're really agnostic about where the science comes from. So we don't care if it's done internally or externally. It really helps when you're looking for good science and good innovation if you have got internally good people, because you have to know what it is you're potentially buying or working with. But the partnership approach and the realization that we can't do it all ourselves because we simply don't have, we have some brilliant people, but we don't have all the brilliant people, has been absolutely key. And I think the other thing that we've done is we've tried to focus in on a limited number of therapeutic areas, but go very deep on them, so that we do know what we're looking at, we know the space, we've got our own internal discovery, but we've also got a very close link to what's actually happening externally. And then through things like the innovation centers, J-Labs, we're closely connected with that sort of innovation environment. And that's not just about sort of chemistry and new chemical entities, that's also into the digital space and so on and so forth, where we see the link between the two. I think you can differentiate drugs in lots of ways. It doesn't just have to be their pure safety and efficacy. If you can bring them with an appropriate diagnostic, if you can bring them with appropriate digital tools, that provides you with a differentiation into a market space. And actually, in time, that may even be more sustainable than the patent life, because you're providing a service around the drug. So rather than sort of competing there, I think there's a real opportunity to collaborate.
You talk about collaboration, but oftentimes smaller companies in particular find that when they get within big pharma, that's when they kind of sort of get the innovation and the thing that made them special pretty much beaten out of them. So is there anything you're doing at JA to stop that kind of sort of death of internal innovation with these small companies?
Yeah, we try and use a small stick, but I think it is a challenge. I think you have to recognize that for anybody coming into a big company, and there are lots of, this is the way we do it, et cetera, if you've been used to running your own business with a small number of people, making that transition can be quite difficult. We try and be as sensitive as we can to that, recognizing that actually, yes, you may be bringing an asset, and that may have a book value, but the associated people around that asset are critically important as well. So I think it would be very easy for me to say, yeah, we've cracked it and it's easy and so on and so forth. You probably need to talk to some of the people who've come into J&J with their assets. But I do think we are aware of the challenge and probably making some strides to actually resolve that. I think you've also got to recognize that the cultural fit here is not always the same. I mean, the entrepreneurial culture that really drives a lot of the biosector is people who are used to getting stuff done, within a week, moving on, bright ideas, et cetera, and they want to move on to do that again. And I think that's also another model is okay, you've got it to that point, let's pick it up from there and move it forward. So you don't necessarily have to buy the vineyard to drink the wine. You can actually take other approaches that bring the asset across with the links and so on and so forth. There's different models that you can use. And I think, again, there's been a lot of innovation in that space as to how those business models are developed.
Okay. Jessica, are you seeing sort of like, sort of smaller companies sort of more willing to partner with Big Pharma?
Oh, of course. I mean, every small company in the health space wants to partner with Big Pharma. That's the dream. It's the challenge of can they? Okay. And the hurdle to actually work with a J&J is quite high, as it should be. These are large established institution, and their brand is their value, and they do not compromise when it comes to quality. And it doesn't matter if you're a 5-person startup team, they expect excellence, as they should. And I think that's the hurdle that many startups face, is they have a concept, they have something that's working, but it hasn't been proven to the extent that it needs to be to be brought into a large institution. So, when I was chief digital officer at Bayer, I'd see so many of these startups come through. And I always applauded their effort and their energy and their passion to use their gifts to make the world a better place and help with healthcare. But often there's just no way that their product would survive in the real world where it's under scrutiny. It didn't survive in practice, and to bring it in and develop it, we could find a better team or a more qualified team. So it's really a challenge to merge, the unicorns and the dinosaurs. They speak different languages. Now, I will, since you won't toot the J&J horn too loudly, I can do that. I think J&J does an exceptional job of working with startups. I know the one I mentioned, Hugo Health. It's a very small team, so under 10 people, and they're working, doing trials with J&J, and the collaboration is beautiful because, like you said, you're agnostic as to where the science comes from. If it works and it's reliable, you do a great job of utilizing it, and without compromising the culture of the startup. If anything, you encourage the startup to keep its culture so that it continues to innovate faster to bring you more success. So I think a lot of it depends on culture. So J&J's culture is very good at this. Some other pharma cultures may be a little more rigid, and it may be a challenge to have that more personal interaction that enables that type of agility. If you have to follow a process and that's the only way to do it, well, then you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities.
Okay, one horrible moment. I thought you were going to call Steve a dinosaur, but
no.
That's the grey hair.
But I mean, will anybody on this panel be prepared to call out some of the dinosaurs that we're seeing when we aren't seeing? I mean, we've spoken about the companies where we are. Obviously, Novartis. Everybody loves Vas at the moment. He can do no wrong, and rightly so, from what we're seeing at Novartis. But there are any companies that aren't, innovating fast enough or considering their future.
Well, none of them are innovating fast enough. I mean, let's be clear. We're all super impatient. There is an unmet medical need, and we do meet the patients, and we meet with their families, and we meet with the physicians. There is not a fast enough out there. But given our regulatory environments, given the hurdles we have, given the pace of change in the ecosystem, pharma is trying to go faster, but it is really hard. So I think none of us are going fast enough.
Well, we've seen the FDA. I mean, Scott Gottlieb, who'll be speaking here later, has done some fantastic work in terms of, speeding up the idea of incorporating the new sort of digital technologies into the approval process. I mean, do you think that is going to help the industry? I mean, we have what seems to be a very friendly regulator at the moment, in all sorts of ways, not just through digital.
I mean, this is one of the positive things you can say about this administration. Maybe one of the only positive things is that. They have been really strong in encouraging innovation and sharing health data and in access to innovation. So, I love the huge push right now that is being seen across CMS and ARC to empower people with their own data, the push for more interoperability, the push for more data sharing. That is going to feed all of these startups and their APIs, which are then going to feed back into the real world evidence and feed back into that loop of innovation that we all thrive on. So the ecosystem is changing in the US, and that's a good thing. Now, the challenges with this administration, you just don't know how long it's going to last. And if you're a dinosaur, again, you take slow, deliberate, thoughtful steps. There's no quick, agile turns. So it's anyone's guess as to how much of a sustainable impact that'll really have.
Bernard, would you like to identify a dinosaur? I want one of you to actually name a company.
I think it's clear that the industry as a whole has a problem with value creation. If you look at the studies that Deloitte has been putting out every year, according to them, the industry has stopped creating value, or rather, the return on research has slipped below cost of capital 6 or 7 years ago and has gotten steadily worse. You've got a blogger at Novartis who was arguing that that return will drop below zero before 2020. So however you look at it, the slide that you showed, there is a problem with value creation. But I think, looking at it as a whole, occults the fact that there is indeed a subsegment of the industry that is creating value, and then there's another part that is destroying value. And this is what is being sorted out as we speak. And the numbers, frankly, needs to be worked out a little bit, need to be refined before being published. But some people are working on that. So the fact that the value creation is an issue is a blessing in disguise, because if it weren't, there would be less of an urgency, less pressure to change. We need to change or we're going to disappear. That's basically what we're up to. So that is putting enormous pressure onto all of us, really, to adjust. Industries do not disappear. There's always some survivors out there who find a way to tweak the business model and adapt it to the new realities. That's what we're seeing in pharma today. You've got companies that are oblivious to that and it will disappear. I mean, we've lost 6 or 7 big pharma since the year 2000. Yeah. So it does happen. And then you have others that are adjusting faster than others, and those that will be the survivors. And you can see it already. The J&J, the Bristol Myers, the Gilead, and so forth. Companies that are focusing their investment in the right place and succeeding as a result and growing as a result. And others tend to be a lot more sleepy about it, and it's going to be a problem for them.
Still, nobody's actually willing to name a company. Lots I'm going to have to let this one go.
Do you have one you want to name, Lisa?
Yeah. No, okay. I'm just moderating here.
Just wanted to check.
So, Bernard, you said that some companies were going to disappear. I mean, is there a sort of idea of some other external industries taking their place? I mean, we've seen some arguments. In fact, we've seen lots of interest from people like Amazon in the healthcare space. We've also seen, obviously, Google and Apple are very active.
Well, yes, perhaps. Amazon is champion in managing processes. Processes do not produce innovation.
Okay.
The critical mass for innovation is basically one human brain. You don't need to be big in order to produce innovation. You just need to hire the right kind of people and create a culture that's supportive of innovation. You can be small, you can be big, but that's what you got to do. So Amazon can do a lot of things in order to squeeze out the inefficiencies in healthcare, but coming out with new drugs, I don't think they would be the best position there. Google is doing all kinds of interesting things, and they're well positioned, and Apple as well, to harness the technologies that hold great potential in slashing some of the costs that need to be slashed. Clinical research, for example, with all those new biosensors and all that sort of thing. I mean, if you use that stuff as it should be used, the early data that is incoming show that you can, cut the cost by as much as 80%. That's what we need to do. We need to change the economics of drug R&D. You're going to change it by harnessing those technologies. technologies. So, those are the reason to be optimistic. But, will Google produce new drugs? 23andMe is doing some interesting things. They've got the data, they know how to analyze it, they know how to, use it in order to formulate new hypotheses about the cause of the disease and so forth. And that's part of innovation. So they can certainly play a role in that, but their capabilities to bring drug to the market is not demonstrated. And let's keep in mind that this is an enormously complicated industry. Bringing, a drug to the market and navigating the regulatory system, not just in the US, but around the world, takes enormous skills. And, you basically need people who've done it before. And those aren't at Google. They are at J&J.
Jessica, you're dying to jump in here.
Yeah, why would Google and Amazon want to start doing toxicology studies and have labs with beagles and rabbits? And why would they want to do first in man and phase 2 and phase 3? Where they really shine is on the advanced analytics. And, so I think what that's a long way of saying is that nobody wants to do big pharma the way that big pharma does it. So they're pretty safe. But there are a lot of people who want to come partner with us to help us do it better in different aspects. And that's where there's a huge opportunity. I would love it if Amazon decided they were going to try to do, tox phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and work with all the regulators around the world. But to build up that institutional knowledge and to build up those relationships, it's just not something that you would see happen short of 20 years from now. People underestimate how complex global drug development is. There's a reason all these big giants are big giants. It's really complicated. I don't think tech companies want to do that.
But you do think they want to partner?
Well, it's a $1 trillion industry, right? Yeah. So if you're innovating, this is a huge market, and if you also get to help your family members and help unmet medical need, well, there's nothing better to do. That's what everybody's children and nieces and nephews should be studying and trying to do right now is use technology to meet the sustainable development goals of the world. And for all the trillions of dollars we're investing in innovation in pharma, we're still not moving the infant mortality rate or the poverty numbers and the hunger numbers the way that we should around the world. So we see these tech companies and their potential. They want to get into this space, but very few of them have the people. These startups are all great, young, ambitious people, but they don't have the experience to know what it really takes. There's a huge amount of naivete, which is great. That's why they're giving it a go. They don't have the experience. All of these things, you could see them as a plus because they're tackling challenges others would shy away from. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the reason these big pharma companies are successful is because they have mastered something through mostly processes, you're right, to meet all the regulatory demands and to meet the safety regulations and to meet the ethics obligations. And that's a huge institutional burden.
Steve, are you doing any collaborations with tech companies that you want to?
Yeah, a lot. I think a couple of things. The issue of health or ill health, there's a problem with a biological system.
Yeah.
And that is what basic science, basic medical science and R&D and so on is focused on. So determining that is probably the remit of highly innovative scientific investigation with a lot of experience, a lot of background, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's something that you can replace overnight. And you certainly can't replace it by sort of intensive digital analysis. That said, as we move towards not necessarily just treating end-stage disease, but actually detecting disease at an earlier stage to try and intervene to prevent it, that is where I think there are huge opportunities for the phenotypic data that can be collected by companies and analyzed and made sense of. And the ability of large tech companies, small tech companies, to look at specific aspects of that and then link it back to some kind of genotypic system which can then be acted upon by some kind of druggable intervention, I think will continue to grow. So in the longer term, I think this will become more and more important. And as we look at trying to figure out Alzheimer's disease, and you know, some of these more complicated diseases, particularly in the, it's less relevant in oncology, for example, where you've got pretty good biological models. You might look at, you know, at, genetics from a susceptibility point of view, but in the CNS, where you really struggle because you know, you can't biopsy the brain, it really is challenging, and therefore the ability of companies to be able to put this data together and actually crunch the numbers and give you some pointers, if you like, I think will start to, well, it already is, significantly influence drug development. Whether that's something that those groups will want to take on, I think that's unlikely. So therefore, I think it is about partnership, and there are many partnerships, both actually within the industry. So we partner actually with our competitors at an early stage because we've all got data, so let's put it together. But you need skilled people to actually figure out what's going on there, but there's no reason that we shouldn't share that data. But then also externally, with people are picking up things and saying, okay, this is a smart area that we could be looking at, let's work with you because you then can translate that into something that can impact the biological system. So I think partnership's the way forward, and I think it will become more and more important as we intervene earlier in disease.
And do you think, I mean, obviously when you talk about intervention, we're looking at things like, you know, the idea of digital biomarkers and wearables. I mean, are we going to see more of those? I mean, are we going to see potentially the Novartis, I don't know, a wearable for just plugging your data through your wearables into clinical research? I mean, I know Novartis signed deals with Pear Tree, so where we're looking at collecting that digital data. I mean,
yeah, I mean, that's one of the premises of the baseline study that Verily is doing, is this huge collection of data from a wearable that's on 24/7. And you are starting to see the more traditional giants sharing more information. So if you have an implantable, being able to finally get access to that data and now sync it so it connects with the rest of your information. There's a few good studies going from the FDA NEST program that are doing exactly this. So, you know, taking that data from your wearables, your implantables, even like your pacemakers, and integrating that into your integrated health record. So, you know, those type of innovations, I think we're already seeing today, and we will continue to see more of, because why not? It's such a rich, meaningful source of information that should be integrated into the more holistic picture. And frankly, it's low-hanging fruit. You know, the data's there, the tech is there. Now, what the magic we're looking for is how to see the signal through the noise, and we're getting increasingly better at that through advanced analytics.
but that also, doesn't that bring up issues of, like, you know, who owns that data?
Absolutely.
If everybody's collaborating and we're all getting on well, and like tech companies and we're all feeding data into, ultimately, I'm now big pharma, I have shareholders, you know, I want to see some return on that.
I wish you were big pharma.
So do I, I'd be so wealthy. Who then actually owns that? Who then owns that?
That's the big question right now. So legally in the US, you have a right to all of your own health data. I mean, I bet a lot of you didn't even know that. So you legally have a right to any health information about you. The question is, how do you access it? Where do you get it? In what format do you get it in? And that's probably one of the hottest discussions we're going to have over the next 4 or 5 years, is who owns that data? So, you know, you saw the example of Flatiron Health. You know, billions of dollars. What do they do? Well, you know, it sucks data from cancer centers and organizes it. But was somebody asking all of those individual oncology patients? Well, no. And so, you know, as the field evolves and these, you know, the rights of people and their data continues to be in discussion, I think that's going to be a rather contentious issue, because right now the question is, well, you may own the data, but your own data by itself is somewhat useless, except to you. It's not until it's brought together that there's real meaning for public health and for greater innovation. So, Bernard, I'd be curious to see what you think about that.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is clear. The patient owns the data, period. Full stop. Now, the data today, and they own the data basically because it is their decision to allow data collection upon themselves or not. Now, there's a lot of data that is being collected on each one of us every day as we speak that ends up in inaccessible areas. And that's unfortunate, but it will likely to change as far as health is concerned. You already have Apple, which several years ago has taken a very clear stand that, hey, you know, we will sell you iWatches, we will sell you, biosensors doing, or enabled iPhones or whatever. But we're in it for the hardware. That's the only thing that is of interest to us. We don't care about your data. We will give you space in the cloud so that all your data can accumulate there for years, decades, until you need it, but we won't even look at it. And this is a sort of reassurance that patients need. Now, once, each one of us has several petabytes of data up in the clouds, it's up to us to decide what we want. We can sell it. We can, decide to connect with like-minded patients in order to advance discovery in a particular disease that's of interest to us. All kinds of possibilities are there. And I think we will see this more and more. But the business model that are predicated on kind of stealing data from people without letting them know and then reselling that data to the highest bidder, I think this is probably not a sustainable business model in the future, because I don't think it's going to fly with the patients.
Well, and it's just old-fashioned, right? Because maybe that worked in the past, but now we actually do have technology where individuals can sync their own data, and they can choose to share it with researchers, and they own it. So if you want to compensate them with some Amazon gift cards for sharing their integrated data, you can. So, it's just sort of the old-fashioned model. Now, I think increasingly there's a pressure, and I think J&J is doing a great job of leading in the space of seeing the patients as partners, not subjects. So the patient is a partner in research, not a subject in a trial, which means at the end, you give them an update on how the study went. You give them back the data into their integrated record. You then have treated them as a partner so that 5 years from now, when you need to go back to do a study at the FDA's request, and you reach out to them, they'll say, yeah, absolutely, you can access the data because you've treated them with that respect. So I think we're really seeing an evolution that's long overdue in the pharma space, and that really is thanks to both the public opinion and the demand for it, but also technology is finally enabling it.
I was going to ask you about whether or not we're going to see more patient-led innovation, not just people sharing their
I
data.
hope so.
I've got an unmet need. What are you doing?
Well, if people have control of their data, like Bernard just said, cohorts of patients could get together and make that integrated data available to researchers to work on. So you can actually incentivize research in rare disease areas faster because you already have that community of people willing to share their data and attract those researchers.
Yeah, it already exists. I mean, the patient-driven R&D model is alive and well. And I've seen countless examples now of people coming up mostly in a rare disease space.
As I say, it tends to be in the rare disease space.
And they put together, they find other patients around the world that have their disease, and they put together a cohort, they start collecting data about themselves, they talk to scientists, and before you name it, they raise money, they're very good at that. With that money, they fund basic research, and before you get it, you know it, you've got a viable R&D program that's underway. I think we've seen that enough times now. It is real, and it will spread. That digitization of science is one of the changes that we are in the process of harnessing to change the economics of drug R&D. The 1 million patient cohort that NIH recently launched, all of us, that also will be a game changer because we'll have 1 million patients out there to draw from using advanced analytics, the kind of Google is so good at, in order to start understanding diseases that so far we have not understood. And unless we understand disease at the molecule level, we understand what causes them, we cannot innovate. So this is going to remove a big hurdle to our ability to innovate.
I think to your question on IP, I think the IP is not the data. I think there is so much being generated, and there will be very significant further consolidation of that. I think there's two things. Firstly, having the data is great, but unless you have a question to ask, then it's useless. And secondly, I think the IP will remain on the intervention. So the identification of the disease or whatever it is that comes from that data and the appropriate use of that. And even for things as simple as if you think about your car, every now and again the service light comes on. I don't quite know how that's based, but I'm told there's multiple sensors in the car that determine that that's actually what. We can do that for cars. We don't do it for people, which seems a little bit odd. But as and when we do, from a farm industry point of view, I think that's a great thing, because it actually then says you need some intervention.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's a good idea if you remember to take it. So even the simple areas of sort of facilitated compliance, which in the end are good for patients, but also good for us, I think really that will develop on the back of sort of very integrated data sets with appropriate questions answered.
So, I mean, we talked about, how it seems like, one of the ways that pharma is going to fix its innovation problem is going to be through the use of, I don't know, digital technologies and embracing digital health more. But are there any kind of sort of barriers? And we talk about as if this is amazing utopian world. I mean, we've got huge issues around
This world?
no, the future world we're talking about. Data interoperability. I mean, at the moment you have multiple data sources. And if we're going to talk about that huge amount of data crunching that we're going to need, surely we need to be able to standardise those. So is that one of the biggest hurdles we're seeing towards the adoption of digital health?
I'm not a data expert, but I was saying earlier to somebody, about 10 years ago, we did an exercise looking at what data we had and so on. And interoperability was a huge issue. But it seems now that there are some very smart people who've figured out that this actually isn't a problem. So using things like Big Table and so on and so forth, actually you can get data sets that talk to each other. And people are now talking about data lakes and so on. And not only do we have data lakes, but it seems the fish in those lakes can actually speak the same language. So there's an awful lot of progress behind the scenes that's actually facilitating outcome from that. I think one of the challenges we face as large companies is actually making sure that we are building the data from the very beginning, so from discovery through the phases through to market access. There's an enormous amount of data generated, and we need to figure out how we pull that better and actually leverage that earlier. So there are I think it's less interoperability issues now because many of those seem to be solved. I'm not a technical data expert, but I'm told that to a significant extent is doable.
Getting better.
It probably makes it easier if you line it up to start with, but then you have to have a basis for doing that. And I think the push to get earlier engagement of things like market access data, patient engagement, et cetera, is really driving us to say, okay, let's put it all in the same place and let's make sure that it's reasonably standardized so we can interrogate it.
Yeah, I mean, how many of you in the audience have heard of Mint.com? Right, the financial tool, you sync up your bank accounts and your mortgage and your cars, and it pulls it all together and it integrates. And even though when you log into those portals, the data looks very different, when you see it in Mint, it's all sort of in the same format and it's harmonized and standardized. So there are tools exactly like that now for healthcare. So you're not solving for interoperability because Cerner and Epic still speak sort of different languages, and when you pull it together, you still need to do some normalization. But there are tools that do that on the back end and do it in a really cool way. The challenge is for most individuals, most of you here don't have a Cerner health record and Epic health record that you need to pull together. You have one. So where it comes in handy is more on the research side for unlocking it for innovation. But hopefully soon, and again, this goes back to this big political push we're finally seeing, and I have to thank Apple for jumping in and shedding a bunch of light on this issue of interoperability. By these big players like Amazon and Apple saying they want to get involved in this space, it's actually helping to put transparency on all the health systems that have been holding their data close to their chest and not sharing as much as they should. So we're getting to this pretty exciting point. I mean, for all of us who've been sitting in these conferences for the last decade hearing about the promise of interoperability in electronic health records, I think we're finally getting to the place where that's not all baloney. It's actually going to be useful. So we're getting closer.
Okay. I'm going to throw I like throwing the curveballs in here. What about, I mean, we talk about these, the idea of digital health, but are we going to sort of get to the point where we have the digitally kind of enabled and the digital have-nots? Because it seems to be...
Yeah, you have that now.
And isn't that going to get worse? I mean, I know I'm thinking about perhaps the aging population that perhaps aren't quite as comfortable with, wearables, sharing their data. And surely they're the people that we're going to be needing to produce more medicines for.
Yeah, it's a great question, but it turns out that a lot of the people that have implantables and wearables, maybe they're not the ones that need to access and understand the data. So let's say you've got a pacemaker. You don't actually need to go look at the data from your pacemaker, but if that syncs into a system that is looking more holistically, that you do have a care manager looking at, they're the ones that are going to see the signals sooner. And so, for these populations that may not be as digitally native, we're still seeing a very high adoption rate. So, they may not, they may still have a flip phone and not have an iPhone, but they can still access their portals and sync their portals to pull their data together to contribute to research or to be part of an intervention or a study. So you're right, the gap is big and growing globally, but in the US, you don't necessarily have to be part of a digital generation to benefit from the promise of digital medicine, which is good.
Okay.
There is, you got to be careful there, because on the face of it, you'll be tempted to believe that all the technology and the expertise that it requires in order to use it well will indeed drive a wedge in the population between have and have-nots. On the other hand, and that's true to a certain extent, on the other hand, look at what's happening in Africa, where you have people who are, at the level of literacy, which is way below what we've got in this country. And they are early adopters of all these technologies in their efforts to put together from scratch a healthcare system that doesn't exist today. And they're very good at it. And it's flip phone or whatever. I mean, they are doing wonderful things. I don't think the threat of a divide in a population is perhaps as real as it seems to be. There is counterexample that I think we need to think about.
Okay. Unless you're really looking globally. So I'm on an advisory board for the UN, for the ITU, International Telecommunications Union. And our big challenge is getting ICT, Internet Communications Technology, for the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And globally, there's still a lot of the world that doesn't have access to basic Internet Communication Technology. So yes,
there is.
there is a gap that is growing and getting bigger. At the other hand, what Bernard said is exactly what's happening. They're not just following in our paths, obviously, they're leapfrogging. And so some of the innovations we see there with the digital IDs and mobile banking, are things that I wish we had here in the US to a greater extent.
I suppose because they don't have that legacy, I suppose, of technology that we have to overcome. They're actually just going straight in there.
It's a cumbersome legacy.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of the session. I think we have got time for some questions. But just to sum up, I'm just saying to the group, it sounds like there is a problem with innovation. Perhaps it's not as bad, it's not as sort of negatively as I made out, but and a lot of things we're looking at, like digital health could be one of the ways to solve that, and also the kind of sort of changing attitudes amongst the leadership in some of the big pharma groups. But sort of one last question to all of you. I mean, what does perfect innovation look like to all of you? And it's a bit of a tricky one, I'm sorry. Or one example of the most exciting bit of innovation that you've seen in the last, 12 months in the healthcare space.
She saves the hardest question for last, huh?
I'll take a shot at it. I think things like, the CAR Ts and all that have gotten a lot of press. And, these and other technologies, gene editing, have indeed enormous potential. If we can make them work, they truly will be transformative. And my hope is that it will happen. We've got a lot of smart people working on it. So that's exciting. But I think shorter term, there's even bigger benefits to be harnessed from to be gotten from harnessing digital technology to a much greater extent than we're doing today. There's still thousands of diseases out there for which we have no baseline data. And FDA, if you ask them, they will tell you that the number one obstacle to innovation from their standpoint is that lack of baseline data. If you don't have that, then you cannot, by definition, measure how much a therapy will improve over, a baseline data that doesn't exist. So collecting that data, on all of us, is a first step towards starting to understand, how disease develop and how we might be able to come up with disease-modifying drugs. And the technology exists. It's right there. It's in our watches, it's in our cell phones. We just need to get better at using it.
Okay. Steve?
I think what you say about CAR T, etc. I think those things are driving further innovation in terms of business model. And that's an area where, we have spent a lot of time trying to demonstrate value over many years. Here you're looking at interventions which potentially are curative. How we actually evaluate those and how those are remunerated,
Yes.
that's going to drive huge innovation. And so there's almost an imperative to not just change on the sort of the R&D molecular side, but evolve the business as well. And I think, I'm not sure that we figured that out yet, but that is a very exciting area, I think, in terms of business innovation.
Jessica, you got the final word?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in 3 big areas of innovation right now, which is the real world evidence, so groups like Hugo that I mentioned, precision medicine, helping to get the right patient to the patients that are right medicine to the patients that will respond, groups like CureMatch out of San Diego, groups that are helping to improve the overall integration and care management, even pulling in family members to make sure they can get a ride to the clinic to get their wet AMD injections in their eye. And groups like that would be Fatango and MeadowPad. There's a lot of really cool innovation in this space now that's pretty exciting. But I have to say the thing that excites me the most about this field is for once we're now seeing diversity in innovation in this field. So, it's no secret, I came from a predominantly big German company, and now you're starting to see companies that are led by people that look different and have different experiences and different passions. And I think that diversity of leaders coming up in the pharma and biotech space holds greater promise than everything else, because for once it's not a bunch of old white guys, sorry. It's really...
20 old white guys out there, sorry.
But it's important to see that the change of people doing the innovation is different than it was before. And it just historically, looking back, that's what the history is. And now we're writing a new history where many more people are involved in innovation. And I find that to be tremendously exciting. And I think that holds the greatest potential for us to make progress.
Well said. And I'm not going to... Should I apologise to any old white guys out there who were offended?
No, they've done an amazing job. I mean, look
Well
at how far
done.
the industry's gotten.
Well
So
done. You can have
I'm
a
not
rest
complaining.
now, and nobody else we can let some other people take over. So well done for carrying the load for so long.
I know you can't see the clock, but we have 10 minutes left
Okay,
for
10
questions.
minutes. Can we have any questions out there? I don't know if we've got mics actually. So
Yes, there's a mic right here in the middle, so the gentleman closest, and then maybe you can't see, there's another one over here.
I can't see anything up here.
Tim LaCroix, Rance Medical Silhouette. Thank you for a lively discussion and a bold one, too. Obviously, a difficult topic to take on. I'm curious about just the fundamental lack of change in how drug development is done. If you think about it, over the many years, notwithstanding talk about adaptive drug design and certainly some changes with rare diseases, oncology, certainly, we still have the fundamental same pathway we've had for 10, 20, 30 years, right? Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Certainly we're seeing more upfront work in phase 1, where more studies are looking for actual cohorts of patients, as you know, in phase 1. But we still have a fundamental process that is quite elongated. So I'm curious as to your thoughts about that. And are there more lessons learned from, in fact, rare disease drug development, for example, or oncology, that we could bring into the fold with more, we'll call it more mainstream drug development?
I make a couple of comments. I think I think you're right, and some of the frustration there, I think, lies with the sort of evolution of regulations and the need to have everything presented in the same way. So we can evolve, but we need others to evolve with us. When you talk about use of databases, so we have a very close relationship with the Karolinska Institute, and in Sweden everybody has a number, okay, a little bit like the UK. And the advantage of having that is that you can do population analysis on diseases. So it's led us, particularly in oncology, where nobody wants the placebo, where we've actually developed methodology to actually be able to do controlled trials against a case-matched placebo group, or nominal placebo group. They're just not, they don't ever get the drug. So things like that are happening, but the acceptance of those and being able to then justify that to the regulators and so on, it takes time. And I think quite rightly, because they carry the can if they let something through that is not safe and effective, so it's reasonable. But more and more, I mean, we're looking at adaptive design, looking at platform studies where we can, try and accelerate a number of different compounds through you set the study up once and then you can run multiple compounds through it. So there are ways of improving what we do, and we continue to look at them. You know, one of the prime drivers behind that is expense, because it's very expensive to do it this way. But I think, again, big data has really facilitated our ability to do that. Is it going quick enough? No. But I think there are areas where we are making changes.
I might add a comment. I think the system that you describe was cobbled together over the decades during a time in which drug candidates were, by and large, fairly mediocre. So it's a system, basically, that has been designed to shepherd mediocre compounds to market. Now, you're looking at what happens when, instead of having a mediocre compound, you have a breakthrough compound from the get-go. Go back to, for example, Gleevec. You know, Gleevec was approved on the basis of one trial with 54 patients. You know, you look at what happened with Kalydeco. You look at what happened with CAR-T when, you know, the excitement, you know, all of a sudden exploded when patients that were supposed to die within weeks, 4 weeks later were cured. And when that happens, then there's no phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Then everybody wants to get that drug onto the market as quickly as possible, whatever it takes. So you got breakthrough designation to help you basically bypass this old antiquated system and rush this to market. I think what the industry can do in order to change, you know, the cost structure and its dynamics and its timelines is focus on coming up with a lot more compounds of the quality of Gleevec and Kalydeco and CAR-T, as opposed to some of the stuff that you see today in a pipeline, which is basically doomed to progress slowly and cost a lot, and ultimately not making much value, much difference to the patients when it gets to market. We need to read the pipeline of those things.
So it's basically about unmet medical needs and true innovation. Sorry, gentleman waiting here.
Hi, my name is Song Kwon, and I'm with LG. I really appreciated your discussions on digital health, and I have 2 questions on that. So the first one is, what's your take on the current genome sequencing efforts, like a company called 23andMe, all of those attempts to collect data and try to connect with pharmaceutical companies and use that data to create better drugs and better outcomes. And the second question is, out of all the innovation going on with CAR-T and genome editing tools like CRISPR and Cas9, how do you reconcile your data from digital health and maybe genome sequencing data or in leading your innovation?
Everybody's looking at Steve for this one again, or Jessica, do you want to take this one? Jessica?
Sure, I'll start. First, great question. Thank you. I think groups like 23andMe and Color Genomics, you know, they really are tapping into consumers' interests to have their information, and you know, they are obviously working with pharma on the back end, sharing that data for research. You know, it's getting us closer to the promise of precision medicine, which is what we all want. So any innovation in this space, frankly, you know, we'll take, because we do want to get closer to knowing who's going to respond best to what treatments. Steve, do you want to say anything about how you're working with it?
Yeah, I mean, we are doing a lot of analysis, particularly in early disease states, because the one thing that we've had historically is that it's the epidemiology of the disease. You know, so we know the incidence and so on, and that's sort of been historically recorded. We're now able to mine databases that actually, where we can take the phenotypes from different sources, from different databases, and actually correlate those against genotypes. And increasingly, data is going to be made available where you have both. So you have an integrated data set of both the phenotype and the genotype. And from the point of view then of actually designing interventions, you're really in a very, very different space. So it takes you, for example, if you're looking at a specific mutation, many mutations cover multiple tumors, for example. So instead of going after one tumor, you can actually say, no, we want to go after this mutation, which will be present in a number of tumors. So on the one hand, it takes you into precision medicine, which is a little bit of a commercial nightmare potentially, because it's a very small number of people. Okay, so that's another thing that we have to figure out. But the ability to then actually look more broadly at whatever mutation it is and design drugs that will intervene across a range of diseases in a sort of pathway sense is substantially increased. So it's becoming a fundamental tool in terms of how we really look at drugs in development.
But I would also caution, we still don't know what we don't know when it comes to the human genome. So there's a lot of excitement, but it sort of does remind, I think, a lot of us of when antibiotics came out and everybody took antibiotics for everything, and now we're just learning about how important your microbial flora is to perhaps helping with your response rates to oncology treatments or helping with your overall health. So, you know, there is a big rush to move forward in genomics, but it is a place where I would caution time is important here because we've got to get this right. So while it's exciting to watch the speed of interest, I would hope that we continue to maintain a very deliberate, thoughtful, long research process to make sure that we understand what we're doing when we are innovating in the genomic space.
Okay. Well, I think we've got time for one more question.
Just, I'd like for you to comment your presentation when you mentioned that $25 billion per drug, and Dimasi data, 2016, $2.87. I looked $billion, and there are also several published papers where people mentioned that there are $50 million per drug. Just how industry could kind of survive if numbers are 10 times different. It's not like 10%. I would live with that, but 10 times different.
So this is like this is basically everything that fails from preclinical all the way through. It's not what you're looking at is the success rate for a drug that actually makes it the individual R&D spend on that particular drug the way through. What I was looking at is the cost of failure. So this is all the spend, and that's everything. And so it's a drug. It's for drugs that basically don't make it to the market, and that accounts for those spend in those drugs. So that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Dimasi tried to do the same. I don't know details, but he mentioned several times in several discussions exactly the same. Yeah, and we definitely need to compare apples and apples in this kind of analysis. My second point about industry death. I would say the famous quote from Mark Twain. Yeah, everybody knows that. I wouldn't repeat it. I debated with Kelvin this issue on the internet, and I mentioned that it is not big pharma. It is not pharma industry. It's only 10 companies, 10 big pharma companies. But these 10 big pharma companies, number of approvals in the last 5 years was between 25 and 30% of all approvals.
Yes.
Therefore, I would say this set is not fully representative to characterize industry health, I would say. Any comments?
I can address it because I've looked at that actually, and you're right to the extent that the cost or the spend per new molecule varies greatly whether you're dealing with a small companies or a big company. Typically, small companies will bring a drug to market for less than $2 billion. Big companies will bring a drug to market for over $3 and sometimes $4 or $5 billion. It's a cost of structure. And this is what we need to deal with as the industry. We need to find a way to somehow lessen that structural cost so that we spend far less per new drug than we currently do.
I think that's all we have time for. I'm happy to take up any questions you have at the end of the session, but thank you very much for that question. And I would like to give a big thank you to my panelists as well for what I think has been a very exciting and lively discussion. We've covered a lot of things and also tipped on some of the pressing issues of the industry. So thank you for your time and attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.